All right. It's 5 p.m. Central European summertime. For some of you, we saw you're in Indonesia, so it's later at night. Good evening. Some of you were dialing in. I saw Caracas in Venezuela, so good morning to you. And it's really wonderful to have all of you here. This is Live with Impact Hub, and we're thrilled to have you. For everybody who's just tuning in now, you see already some activity in the chat. Feel free to also put in there where you're tuning in from today. It's always good to see the diversity of these groups. Yes, this is Live with Impact Hub. We're super pleased to have a very special guest with us today, which is Thomas Vellacott from WWF Switzerland. Hi, Thomas. It's great to have you. And,
thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. And it's really beautiful to already see so many of you tuning in, and I'm sure that that'll get more in the next minutes. So just to give you a little bit of perspective and a little intro before I hand it over to Thomas. We are, Impact Hub, a global network for social entrepreneurship. And with Live with Impact Hub, we've created a series of online global events with which we want to inspire, to connect, as well as to enable a multi-location audience of entrepreneurs, of ventures, organizations, and different companies to come together around strategic topics such as community building, impact creation, innovation, the Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations, and so forth. As we're, of course, now amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, we have decided to kind of change the topical focus a little bit to make sure that these events are very much focused on topics that matter to you most right now. And we've already had a few live sessions around remote work, well-being in times of isolation, how to manage your business in times of disruption, and there's coming up more in the future. So today, the focus is going to be on environmental action after COVID-19. And so with Thomas Vellacott, I have the perfect person on this call or on this online meeting, because Thomas has been a member of WWF for over 30 years already. In 2001, he joined WWF Switzerland, where he spent 8 years heading up the program division. And since 2012, he is the CEO. And he is also a board member of the Impact Hub Association. And both networks are working very closely together, which is beautiful. For everybody who is not as familiar with either of the networks, I'll give a very short intro. WWF Switzerland has 290,000 supporters and forms part of the WWF Global Network. WWF's missions is to stop the degradation of the planet's natural environment and to build a future in which humans live in harmony with nature. And at Impact Hub, our networks brings together like-minded social entrepreneurs, innovators, and partners, as well as industry professionals, and those who are really passionate about creating lasting change in places and people who are most in need. And so with the idea to inspire, connect, and enable people to drive action to create a more just and sustainable world, that's also how these Live with Impact Hub pieces came into place. So in this partnership, which has been driven and shaped from the very beginning, Thomas has been a very strong force, and we have had this partnership for over 9 years, where we have collaborated and supported innovations to accelerate and to scale solutions, especially focused on tackling environmental issues, of course, as well as to create economic opportunities for local communities. Now, I think that's right about enough from me. Just to add a small note on housekeeping, if you haven't done so already, make sure to mute yourself just so that we can all focus on Thomas a bit more. If everything's correct, you should already be seeing the first slide from Thomas' screen, and he will take us through a presentation which will last round about, well, Thomas already included some of the questions you sent in, so it's going to be a little bit longer. It can be something between, let's say, 20 to 30 minutes. Let's see how we go. And we will keep it a little bit flexible. If any questions come up in the meantime, feel free to put them in the chat. I will make sure that I will put them to Thomas later. So after Thomas is presenting, we will have a Q&A session where we will then also go into more depth on some of the questions you guys sent in beforehand that Thomas has not tackled in the presentation yet, as well as anything that came up during this time. And yeah, after that, we will close just around the hour. So we have about 55 minutes together. And with that, I'm super happy to hand it over to Thomas. Thank you so much again for being here. And yes, take it away.
Thank you very much, Flora, and thanks again for the invitation to be here with you today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. It's a real pleasure to be here. Impact Hub is an organization that's very dear to my heart. As Flora said, I've been involved for over 10 years now with Impact Hub, and it's an organization that is truly very important for the kind of mission that we have of transforming and building a future in which humans and nature live in harmony with each other. So it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining, for taking the time. And I'm happy to take you through a presentation now. I'll just move on, see if I can get this to work. Here we go. So we've called this system change or business as usual, environmental action after COVID-19. The picture you see in the background is an action that the Climate Strike Switzerland organized a few weeks ago. It was actually an action that the Fridays for Future network did in many cities. And I thought it was a nice way of starting, because they had a demonstration planned for that day, a big demonstration. Of course, these are the actions which have been really important over the last 12 to 16 months of really pushing climate change as an issue. With COVID, of course, they could not organize this demonstration, so instead they had shoes demonstrate. And for me, it's a nice symbol, because it just shows how these two crises come together and how we deal with, how we still bring attention to the climate crisis in a situation such as the one we're facing at the moment. What I'd like to do in the next 20-30 minutes is really talk about three things. I'd like to start out with a few thoughts about how do we think about the future, particularly in a situation like we are in at the moment with a lot of uncertainty. Then I'll come to the main piece, which is around what are the triggers of environmental action post-COVID-19, and then end with some thoughts about the role of entrepreneurs in this transition. So let me jump straight in, and as Flora said, I've built in the questions which had been sent in ahead of today. So I hope I can address some of those as I go through. So how do we think about the future? And this is important because this shapes a lot of what we then do and how we initiate environmental action. Well, I've been reading a lot, as I'm sure we all have, and I've been struck by some of the editorial content on news sites or in magazines. And a lot of it, frankly, felt a bit like this. It felt like you sort of read op-eds and you think, whoever wrote this must have a crystal ball at home, because they say things about the future which, without any grounding in facts which you could somehow follow, but they seem to be quite sure about it. And I think we have to be very careful about this. It's, telling the future is hard enough in a time of stability. I think it's even harder in a time of rapid disruption. A related form of thinking about the future is this, where people project what they want to see happening, and they just sort of say that's what's going to happen. And I think we're seeing a lot of that at the moment in a crisis like we are in, where people sort of describe, this is the event where the system changes, or this happens, or I was interviewed by a journalist who was saying, well, now that no one cares about climate change anymore, isn't it just all going to be about business going forward? And I said, but what gives you the idea that people don't care about climate change anymore? But, do you have any data? Oh, no, but I'm sure they don't. And, I have daily data about who's supporting WWF. And I was just telling him, well, sorry, but I don't have any evidence for this. And through the conversation, it just became very obvious that this journalist was pretty cheesed off about the whole climate change discussion and was just looking forward to a time where it was about business again. So that's what their story was about. But there was very little fact behind it, really, that they were basing it on. Another way we can think about the future is this, that we extrapolate from the past. And I'm giving you an example here, which is a few years old. We always do this, right? But what you see here, those colorful lines at the bottom there on the right, those are the scenarios of the International Energy Agency, where they publish these annually, and they say how they see the energy markets developing. And so these are the worldwide experts on all things energy. And this particular chart shows how they projected growth, installed capacity of solar panels, photovoltaics. And the line you see going up there quite steeply, that's what actually happened. And this is interesting for me for two different reasons. One is that these foremost experts got it so incredibly wrong. And the second thing is, even as they were realizing that this line was going up, that something was happening, they changed their forecasts or their scenarios. They changed them and made them slightly more aggressive, but they were still in this linear fashion, of thinking. They were expecting linear growth where in fact there was exponential growth. And I think anything where we extrapolate from the past in a linear fashion is always dangerous, but it's particularly dangerous, again, in a period of disruption, as we're in at the moment with COVID, but as in fact we've been in for a while now on topics such as the energy markets. So, okay, if we don't want to do crystal ball gazing, if we don't just want to project our own wishes and prejudices into the future, if we don't want to extrapolate from the past, how are we to think about the future? And I would suggest a fourth way of doing it, which is actually just going out and observing, collecting clues and examining clues. There's a wonderful quote by William Gibson about who said that the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think really that's what we're trying to look for. Where do we see things which could be indications of what could be coming in the future? So really that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to predict anything. I'm just trying to look for pieces of information which I think might point to things happening in the future. Whenever we talk about the future, and particularly in times of disruption, we absolutely have to approach it with a very, very high degree of humility in terms of, this may be completely wrong. We are making assumptions. We need to constantly check and recheck those assumptions by using data. I think that's the only way we can really sort of feel our way forward almost in this time of rapid change. So that's just a few thoughts to start us off with on how we sort of theorize, how we think about the future. But let me now get into the main piece, which is about, okay, so environmental action post-COVID-19, how do we go about this? And if you're in this space, then this cartoon, which was published a few weeks ago, will have made you smile. Because it sometimes feels like that, right? We're watching the curve, and we're trying to bend the curve and make sure we get through this crisis. And at the same time, we're very much aware that we've got this massive crisis called climate change, which is still ahead of us. And so how can we avoid sort of turning away from the climate challenge, but also the broader challenge around the destruction of nature, while we're focusing on something like COVID? And this is the first one of the questions I picked up, which you sent in ahead of the call. How can we persuade voters and policymakers that the urgency with which they have responded to COVID is appropriate for responding to climate destruction? So we've got these two crises, right? And we're now seeing how the world is responding with urgency, not maybe quite as much urgency as we would have wanted, or not enough persistency in its urgency, but it has responded with urgency to COVID. And how can we make that happen in climate? Well, first of all, I think, although some won't like me saying that, but the two crises are actually quite different in, for example, how we react to them. I think humans respond very differently to a crisis which they see as absolutely imminent than a crisis which they see as there, but maybe not quite as directly threatening to their health today as they would regard COVID. So I think we always have to bear that in mind and not sort of assume we can just take things and transfer them from COVID to climate. But I think really then we have to go down a level and say, okay, let's take this apart a bit. Let's try and understand what these clues are we can see and how we can address this, and in order to persuade people. And maybe that's my sort of hypothesis here on one chart, which I'd like to follow through, which is that COVID-19, like other major disruptions before, probably won't lead to something which is going to be completely different from the situation we had before, but it's also not going to be a return to business as usual. That's not what happens after major disruptions. But what in fact you can see in a lot of disruptions historically, if you look at them, these can be earlier pandemics, these can be wars or other forms of major destructions, is that in fact what happens is that pre-existing trends get accelerated. Not every trend, of course, but a selection of trends. And the reason they get accelerated is because the crisis shines a light onto systemic weaknesses that are behind this trend. So I think really that's where we want to look. We want to find some of these pre-existing trends which are being accelerated through the COVID crisis, because those are the triggers which we can activate in order to accelerate environmental action post-COVID-19. And that kind of is my answer also to a second question here, which was posed ahead of the call today, which was what will be the critical events and actions which will promote systems change, or that could also prevent or should also prevent business as usual or worse. So I would argue it's these triggers we need to go for. Those are the critical things we need to be looking for. I'm glad, by the way, here the person who wrote this wrote systems change in a plural. I find that a lot more useful than thinking of it as one gigantic system. We need to be much more granular and look at how our education systems changes, how our economic systems changing, political systems. This is much more complex than the system. Okay, so what are those trigger points if we then want to go deeper and start thinking about them? And I'll give you 3 categories here and a few examples in each of them. And the first sort of pre-existing trend, which I think is accelerating, are certain economic transitions which were already underway ahead of this crisis. And the most obvious one maybe is the move from analog to digital. Now, of course, this isn't something new. This has been going on for decades. You probably wrote a lot more letters 20 years ago than you do today. You probably read a lot more paper newspapers 20 years ago than you do today. So this is something long term, right? But boy, it's on steroids right now. I mean, with a third of humanity under lockdown, some form of lockdown, it's just a gigantic experiment in, how can we learn to interact in an electronic manner? And I mean, the event we have today is the biggest, is the most recent example of this, or just a small piece of it. So there's a massive change going on here, which is accelerating this digitalization trend, which has been going on. And I mean, think about it. I don't know about you, but I've sort of had this hobby horse about trying all sorts of things online, which I never thought would work online. whether it's yoga classes, whether it's meditation, you name it. And it just seems that there's so much innovation going on in this space at the moment, and everyone is doing it, right? I mean, sometimes it feels like our pets are learning to video conference. It's just, you know, it's become so ubiquitous. And the really interesting question, I think, is now to think about, okay, what of that is just relevant in this crisis? And what is actually going to continue beyond the crisis? And you know, behavioral scientists will tell you that a new behavior, you have to practice it for something like 6 to 8 weeks in order for it to start becoming a habit. And of course, that's exactly the timeline in which we are now with these lockdowns. So this is something which I would argue, I would really pay a lot of attention to this. Which of these behaviors are going to stick? You know, which digital tools are we going to ditch as soon as we can because we can't stand them anymore? And which ones are we actually going to keep? You know, on your right here, this was an article in Time magazine recently about the dating industry and how experts said how that was shifting at the moment and was probably going to continue in a different manner. For example, people using video, which apparently beforehand was considered creepy and now is considered very much part of what you do in online dating. So I think those are the really interesting questions to ask and to look into. So that's the whole digitalization trend, which is being accelerated. A second trend, which I think is being accelerated, is something, again, we've seen happening before this crisis, which is that some of the offshoring, some of the vast networks of globalization have actually started to become more local again. Because it's become more important to have production closer to your target markets. Also because if you're automating a factory, for example, it doesn't make that much of a difference anymore where you put it because you've taken out a lot of the labor costs and so on. So we've already seen some of that. Now, if that continues, of course, you know, that's something which a lot of companies have been thinking about in the last couple of weeks, about how extended their supply chains are and, you know, were they still comfortable with the kind of risks they were running there. And I think we'll see more of this sort of reshoring happening, which of course, like the digitalization trend, if it continues, has huge implications for our ecological footprint. So again, something that's very, very relevant for us if we think about, you know, where do we want to take action in the future? These kind of trends and reinforcing these kind of trends could be a really important, really interesting place to start. A third sector where we're seeing this sort of accelerating transition is, of course, energy. And energy has been in disruption for the last 10 years, in a huge disruption. On your left here, just a quote from Bloomberg. They did a study which showed that 2/3 of the world population live in countries where renewable energy is actually the cheapest form of new energy build of all sources. So that's the complete change to where we were 10 years ago, right? Because costs such as solar have decreased by more than 80% in the last decade. So massive, massive shift here because renewables have become so much more competitive. Now enter COVID. And the interesting thing is that, again, it's almost sort of put this transition, this trend onto steroids, in that it's, you know, coal power has been falling in many markets like the US, again, for several years now. But that's being accelerated now because, of course, you've now got a reduction in energy use because of the crisis. And at the same time, you've got these very cheap energy forms like solar and wind coming online with virtually zero operating costs. So those are the things that's the electricity you're going to use, and the coal is the electricity that's being pushed out. So again, it's accelerating a trend. And the last one of these trends, maybe I might add, is cycling. And this depends a bit on where you sit in the world, but it's certainly not just a European phenomenon. But cycling's been growing quite substantially in quite a lot of metropolises worldwide. And again, this is something which now is just sort of being put on steroids. This is an article from The Guardian about the situation in London recently, saying you can hardly buy a new bicycle because it's becoming so popular again, because it's with social distancing and so on. And mayors are now struggling to build bicycle lanes ASAP, because when they come out of lockdown, they don't want people to go back into public transport in the same numbers they were using it before, but they also don't want them to get into their cars and drive everywhere. So obviously cycling is something that that they would want to encourage. So again, that's a really interesting trend, a little nugget to look out for and to say, okay, how can we accelerate this? So that's the whole sort of first bit, which is all about accelerating economic transitions. And maybe here 2 questions. Do you have any insights, thoughts on how population buying and consuming behaviors will change? If it will, well, I would say in 2 ways it's changing, or I would look at 2 things. One is, where are longer term changes which we're observing? So as I say, the growth of cycling is something which has already been happening for a couple of years. Look out for those kind of things. And look out for behaviors which are changing in the crisis. And where you have those 2 matching up, that's where you're looking at something which has really transformative potential. And this is an interesting question around reusable plastics or single-use plastics, saying, okay, now you've got all this protective kit, that's being produced, all the masks we're being asked to wear, or a hairdresser wearing a single-use plastic cape rather than a more durable one. Does that mean that we're basically reversing the limited progress we've made on avoiding plastics? I would argue here, well, you've got to break this down, and you can't make general comments about plastic. I think this is definitely the case for things like protective equipment, where we will see a lot more, but I would be very careful about drawing conclusions from that to the whole plastic market more generally. So look at how it breaks down, and the medical kit, for example, is in the category others here, which is 16% of the overall market. I'm not sure if that's going to affect our choices on the packaging side, for example. I'll give you a little example. A lot of us are ordering food at the moment from restaurants. Here in Switzerland, there's been a bit of a competition as to who can deliver the food with the least plastic. You get little containers like this that your food comes in, and you put your old container out and they're going to take it with you. Now, if tastes were changing towards plastic, I don't think we would be seeing that kind of behavior. So I think we're actually, there's so much pressure to reduce single-use packaging. I do not see that going away, but I do see changes in things like protective gear. And there's another question which came ahead of time on plastics, which was about a team thinking about creating a business looking at edible drinking straws and partnering with cafes. If you were the owner of a cafe, would you accept our product, and what would be your concern for an edible straw? So 2 thoughts on this. One, there is a huge demand from companies for solutions to reduce their reliance on single-use plastic, because they are under so much pressure from consumers. Again, this will change. This will depend slightly on where you are in the world, but it's really quite a global trend. So I think there is something there. It's a good topic. It's a good sector to be looking at and to develop new solutions. What surprises me is how many companies look at drinking straws in particular. There is something about drinking straws which gets people excited. So I would just maybe think about looking at plastics more broadly and analyzing the market and seeing how many solutions are there already out there in this space. And if I can just go back to the last one, I see much less entrepreneurial action on construction plastic, for example, or on plastic in textiles. So maybe look at those kind of niches as well. And really important when you develop alternative solutions to plastic, pay huge attention to the ecological footprint of the new product you're developing, to make sure that you're not actually creating something which is as bad or even worse than what you're trying to replace. And I'm afraid there are some solutions out there which at first sight look really good, but when you then start going into them, they're kind of not that super. Right, so that was my whole first piece about those three trends. So look at economic transitions that are speeding up and how we can speed them up further. The second piece the second trigger I would look at, where I think we can trigger more environmental action, is this whole theme of building back better. This is about the stimulus packages. This is about the new role that governments are playing in this COVID and post-COVID world. This was a headline from The Economist a few weeks ago, building up the pillars of state. Rich countries are experimenting with radical new economic policies. History suggests that the effects will be permanent. So very often in crises, you get governments taking on a bigger role, and that role does not just disappear after the crisis, but actually often continues. And some of the things that governments have been trying have been absolutely mind-boggling, in the sense that a few weeks or months ago, they would have been absolutely unthinkable. You know, buying back corporate bonds by central banks, things like that. Some of the sizes of the stimulus packages have been just mind-boggling. You know, the US has already spent more than double what it spent 2008 in terms of stimulus money. So this is a huge amount of cash which is being spent here. And whenever you get a huge amount of cash, it's really important you look at how it's being spent. And this is one analysis that was done by a consulting company called Vivid Economics, where they looked at the stimulus packages being proposed and looked at how green they were or not green. And this is an index. It's a bit more than a month old, so it probably would have changed in the meantime. But you see a lot of brown stimulus in here. So a lot of stuff which is actually going in the wrong direction, which is supporting the kind of stuff we need to get out of. And of course, this is really worrying, right? Because if this happens, then we're actually going backwards rather than forwards. So again, let's look at a few examples of what's inside here to see where we might start fiddling with this and changing these stimulus packages. Well, what happens when an industry like coal, which in many countries of the world has become completely uncompetitive, what an industry like coal then does is, if they can't compete on the market, and about half the coal plants out there do not compete economically in the energy market anymore, what do? You go to government, right? And there's no better time to go for government for subsidies than in a situation like now, because there's a lot of money sloshing about, and you can always say, well, we're creating jobs and it's essential infrastructure and if you're well connected, and the coal industry and the oil industry are very well connected politically, then you push these kind of things through. So I think that's something we have to be really super careful about. So I'm hearing a lot of talk about green stimulus, and that's fine. But I think before we get to green stimulus, we really have to avoid the worst brown stimulus packages being put together. And the kind of rescue packages being put together for coal are just really worrying, because this is uneconomic, right? This isn't just really bad for the environment, but it's also really bad for the economy. It's really bad for the health of people. So you know, this is a trigger we absolutely have to go after. And it's not just coal, right? Cars. We had peak car in 2017, the highest number of cars sold. And since then they've been dropping. Well, again, that's being accelerated now through this crisis. What does an industry do? It goes to the government and asks for money. And you know, this is at a time where the car industry is making some very serious moves towards electric vehicles because they've understood that, you know, that's where the future is. Daimler, for example, last year said they were no longer investing in developing new generations of cars. So now is the worst time to pay people money to buy a new internal combustion engine car. Because that's going to be on the road then for another 10 or 12 years, where now should be the time, of course, where we make those changes. And guess what? You know, oil prices going negative. Well, what does the oil industry do? Well, the same thing. They go to the state and try and get subsidies. So we absolutely have to do something about these subsidies. And luckily, that's not the only thing happening in this Build Back Better phase and green and stimulus phase. For example, France is a really interesting example because on the one hand, you get French corporates calling for green and inclusive recovery, and these are not, you know, your little corner shop. These are large corporations saying, if you invest as a government our tax money, do it wisely, do it in a way that it generates value long-term, not just short-term. So again, this is really important, that it's not, you know, it's not business versus the environment, but it's forward-looking business for the environment, and then you've got the backwards-looking business trying to stop things. And then you get things like this, you know, should we rescue airlines? Well, airlines, you know, airlines have a big carbon footprint. So if you do go out and rescue airlines, then yes, I think you should do so with very strict conditions regarding their climate path in order to make sure that the airline is actually going to be around 10 years from now. So make them compliant with reducing their carbon emissions. That's exactly what France is now doing. This is not perfect, right? This is not what we would have wanted to see, but it's a really good effort. You know, for example, saying, look, any flight that if there's a train connection that's less than 2.5 hours, get rid of the flight. Do not operate flights anymore there. So these are kind of concrete things you can do. And that kind of also would be my reply to this question of how can you manage the trade-offs between aid for polluting industries such as aviation and environmental aspects. Well, you try and bring the two together. It's not about one or the other. You try and bring them together and find a sensible compromise there. And what's really encouraging is voices such as this from Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission saying, look, the Green Deal will be our motor for the recovery. These are the kind of things we need to do now where we start building truly green stimulus packages. And I think that's one of the triggers we need to pull now. There was a question about green recovery. You know, is this actually going to happen, especially in the absence of a COP, Conference of the Parties and climate change? What multilateral tools are available? Well, I would argue it's probably not so much multilateral tools at the moment, but you want to be talking to your individual governments. I mean, there is multilateral at the level of the EU, but other than that, it's actually individual governments taking decisions, and I think that's what I would go for. And by showing them that it really doesn't make sense propping up sectors which are going through a massive transition anyway, so you want to help them on that transition rather than keep them in the past. So that was the second piece about building back better. And the final one is about, the final one of these trigger points is One Planet, One Health. And what this is about is, look, I'll sum it up with this picture. These kids are wearing masks. They're wearing masks not because of COVID. They're wearing masks because of the pollution in their city. And this is the same pollution which is being caused by burning fossil fuels, the same source that is also causing climate change. And I think this is really something where we've seen a big change in attitudes even before the crisis, but it's now becoming amplified, which is that the health of us as human beings and the health of the planet are very, very intricately linked. So we get more than 7 million premature deaths a year due to air pollution. So what's bad for the planet is actually proving to be also very bad for us and our health. And of course, that is now becoming much more evident with the emergence of this pandemic, which, by the way, is not a sort of unique event, but we've had 3 to 4 emerging epidemics per year, 3 to 4 emerging diseases a year, and infectious diseases, and about 3/4 of those come from animals, so they're so-called zoonotic diseases. And most of them we don't hear of because they don't go crazy like COVID-19 has now. But so this is something which is happening very regularly. And if we want to avoid the next pandemic, we need to look at this issue and we need to do something about it. And we need to do something about it at 2 levels. One is the obvious one, which is the trade in wildlife. This is one of the largest forms of illegal trade that there is on the planet. It's on a scale such as the illegal weapons trade or the illegal trafficking in human beings. You know, this is huge, right? This is not about the indigenous people going out hunting and consuming themselves. This is about a vast network of illegal trafficking worldwide. And it's not just about the wet markets. The wet markets are just the final piece in the chain, but we need to look at this entire chain and we need to close it down. We need to get rid of this illegal wildlife trade. And I believe what the signs we're seeing out of China are actually very encouraging. China is a country that is responsible for quite a lot of this international trade, and I think it's very encouraging to see these kind of moves out of China to say, you know, we're actually banning this, we're getting much more serious about it. So wildlife trade is something we need to deal with if we want to avoid pandemics. But the second thing, and this is a report we put out a few weeks ago, what people don't realize, or many people don't realize, is that these zoonotic diseases have actually become more frequent, in part because the destruction of natural habitats, because we move in, for example, with agriculture into formerly forested areas, and then go about, and then by doing so, we're bringing wild animals and domesticated animals and humans into much closer proximity, which is a huge risk in terms of zoonotic diseases and spillover from one species to the next. So it's not just about the wet markets, it's not just about the illegal wildlife trade, it's more generally about ensuring we maintain healthy habitats, healthy functioning ecosystems. That's good for nature, but it's also good for human health. There was a question which was put to me about how do we integrate communities for environmental compliance monitoring. I would say communities, local communities, are essential for everything we do in nature conservation. We can never do nature conservation against communities. We can only do it with communities. So they have a huge role to play in maintaining ecosystems. Compliance monitoring is one part of it, but I think it's part of a larger role they have. Okay, and I'm not going to read this out. There was one question about should we move beyond this kind of good guy, bad guy fight between fossil fuels and renewables. Like the coronavirus crisis, we need to manage the climate crisis together. Yes, I agree we need to manage it together. We need to build very broad alliances in order to address the transition we need to see. At the same time, I would argue fossil fuels need to pay for the damages they're creating, and we need to be very, very careful that they're not being subsidized with taxpayers' money, because they have been in the past, and that's been one of the problems we've had, that it's simply been way too cheap to burn fossil fuels. And then a question about communication. We need to be heard by the mainstream and the government. but a soft talk seems to be useless. Can a radical speech be a solution? This is something we debate very often in WWF. How radical does this voice have to be? I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think it's good we have a lot of different voices. We hear a lot of different voices. There are more radical ones, there are less radical ones. But if I go back to the last question about doing stuff together, and if I say we need to build broad coalitions, then I think we need to speak to people in a way that they hear and in a way that is relevant to them. So if you talk to business people, talk to them about business. If you talk to government people, talk to them about the role of government. And I'm not sure shocking people into action works very well. It's not about sweet talking things, but it's about talking to people in a way which is relevant for them. And finally, the role of entrepreneurs. Just a very few thoughts about that. Well, first of all, I think if you're an entrepreneur in this situation, this is a very, very tough situation to go through. I think it's tough for all of us, but I think it's particularly tough for entrepreneurs. This is a Financial Times article about China, but I think this is worldwide. This is a situation. And I would never dare give you advice about what you need to do, because I think a lot of you will be struggling at the moment with very basic issues of cash flow, of ensuring access to investors, of ensuring access to markets. That is clearly very, very an essential piece to just keep operations going. But I think then what will be interesting, if we go back, I'll just take one now, the European Green Deal. We will never get these kind of deals through. We will never get the transition to sustainability which we need if we don't have a huge role to play for entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs will have to drive a large part of this transition. So we need to make sure that these kind of stimulus packages don't just go to the large industries, but that they also support entrepreneurs. And I think that's something really important we need to look at the moment. Because frankly, entrepreneurs will be the engine of this economic transition. This is a study that Credit Suisse did a few years ago, where they looked at the average lifespan of an S&P 500 company, which in the 1950s was about 60 years. In the 2010s, the average lifespan was less than 20 years. So companies are becoming younger. Newer companies are playing much more important roles in the economy than they were 30, 40 years ago. And this is natural. Whenever you have a disruption, it's the entrepreneurs who make it happen. It's not the incumbents. And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. And it's a moment where we need entrepreneurs, where we need innovation, where we need startups to drive this transition. And I think we're all really, really called upon to make sure that they make it through this crisis and that they can play the kind of role, the essential role they have. I think that's where I'm going to leave it really at this point and open it up for questions, because I've kind of gone beyond your 20 to 30 minutes, Flora, so apologies for that.
Absolutely, no worries. And thank you so much for this. We already got some very positive comments connected to this, and people find this very interesting. I can definitely say for myself, I find this super interesting. So thank you. And also thank you for already attending to so many questions that were sent in, because I would hope that it's all the people who are currently tuning in as well. So basically, you already did them a favor and answered a lot of questions. Now, with regards to the remaining time that we have, I just want to make sure that, we try to answer as many questions as possible. However, we want to stop on time. So I'll try to facilitate this in a way that
Good
this
luck.
works out more or less. Thank you. I think one question that's interesting that came from Vic was concerning the North-South dialogue. So the question was, do you think it is possible to improve the North-South dialogue to enhance the design of new power generation alternatives? So how could we improve that dialogue?
Yes, definitely we can improve that. what I find fascinating is how, if you looked at, for example, the renewable energy sector 10 or definitely 15 years ago, then you would have looked at Europe. If you look at renewable energy today, you look at China. So there's already been a shift there in terms of, where a lot of the center of gravity has gone. And I think a lot of the really exciting work happening in renewable energy is now in emerging markets, is happening in the South, is happening in places like India about, how can you deal with, the people who are not connected to the grid, and how can you use energy in those kind of contexts? So I think it's, this old view of technology transfer from the north to the south, I think that's already completely breaking down, in that a lot of the innovation is happening today already certainly in the east, but also in the south. And I think that's going to happen in much more different directions. The challenge more often, I think, is how do you ensure that you get the funding and make the funding available to people in the South? Because while an impact investor might be prepared to invest in a solar startup in Germany, they may feel much less comfortable investing into a solar startup in Rwanda, simply because the country risk for Rwanda is too high for them. And so I think we've got issues around financing more than sort of technology transfer.
Thank you. Another question that got to us was from Barbara Inman from Vienna, and she's asking for your view. What should a community like Impact Hub, with all the diverse individuals and innovation it includes, focus on to support the green and inclusive recovery? So examples, innovations in which area, policy change, community building, something else. And this connects very well with the question that we received beforehand that was in more general, asking how companies can start to contribute to climate change challenges.
So I would argue in two ways. One, and I think particularly, an organization like Impact Hub, which is a whole community of entrepreneurs, we really have to influence those stimulus packages. Because in my experience, in a lot of countries, entrepreneurs have a really poor voice. They're not being heard in the policy debate. Compare it to, like I say, the fossil fuel industry that are doing really well at being heard because they have, 70 years of experience. You're not hearing the entrepreneurial voices. And I think they absolutely have to be heard. Otherwise, we'll be making massive misallocations of capital. So that would be something I would point to, that maybe an organization like Impact Hub, together with others, could become active. Now, as an individual company, or maybe also as Impact Hub, I'd be looking at some of these sectors that I pointed out in my first section about the accelerating transition and say, well, first of all, can we simply just link up the people who are working on cycling or are working on renewable energy or on food? And I know Impact Hub has been doing a lot of this. And then how can we start to share notes about what does the crisis now mean for us? Because again, it's a huge opportunity, but we can accelerate it even further if we use it well.
Thank you. Another interesting question. I hope maybe we can get one more in after this, but let's see. Lieselotte has asked a question concerning airlines and mobility. If it isn't time to maybe think of now Europe specific, of a European mobility network instead of saving individual airlines. So if it wouldn't be better to rethink mobility in Europe, like better and maybe even cheaper train connections, only flights for longer distances and so on. What will be your view on that mobility piece?
So definitely that would be better. Oh yes. I mean, one of the things that I think has been disappointing in the COVID crisis so far has been the role played by Europe, as in the EU. I think there's, it's been quite scary how quickly we go back to our, nationalities and dealing with a crisis like that at a national level. I shouldn't be saying this as a Swiss. I mean, we've never been very good at the multilateral thing, but other countries have been. But so I think, and I think the European Union is very acutely aware of that, and is actually making a genuine effort to play a greater role in the building back better piece. And I think that's why von der Leyen was talking about the Green Deal as one way of doing that. And so I think there is a huge opportunity there to do something which is actually more sensible when we look at it at a continent-wide European level than if we look at it at a purely country level. And should we be saving airlines? Well, as I said, only with a very, very clear trajectory for how they're going to develop something which is climate friendly. And that will clearly mean that many of the flights they did in the past, they will not be doing anymore in the future. So it also means they probably be looking at reskilling some of their workforce, because they will not be able to employ the same workforces. And I mean, you're seeing that now with airlines shedding staff. Can we, instead of just shedding them, can we actually start retraining them in some of the areas where we'll need more in the future? And it's been fascinating for me, for example, seeing how Europe has treated, the night trains. And, a few years ago, everyone was trying to get rid of them. And then the Austrians were smart enough to pick them up and turn them into a profitable business. And now everyone's screaming to have them back again. And so things are changing in that area. I think you are seeing something moving. And it will be really interesting to see whether we are going to get back the $10 flights and those kind of things, which really weren't that interesting for most players in the industry. So I hope we are going to see some correction there.
All right, let's try to get one more in, and I'm grouping two of the ones that I saw in the chat. Let's see if this works out. I give you about 60 seconds to answer, so it's a challenge for both of us. So Sana asked what kind of shift in environmental education you see as necessary in order to make this change happen. And related to that, Joff was asking which other conservation or preservation organizations you are thinking are looking into the future in new ways that can also help lead that systems change.
Wow, okay, 60 seconds. So on education, I think we just need to go way, way broader than we have in the past. We've got a very long education program at WWF, but it just doesn't reach enough kids, to be honest. And we've been doing some really exciting experimenting around digital channels, which will be continuing. And that's something I would see we can reach much more. So it's just about being much, much more broad in how we roll this out. The second question, remind me again, sorry, Flora.
Absolutely, no worries. And I understood actually the environmental education piece as more broad. That's why I thought the two fit together, but the way you took it, they're actually separate. So Joff was asking about the other organizations. Exactly, other organizations that you see are looking into the future in different ways and that can help lead to systems change.
So look, I think one of the amazingly positive things we've seen in the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years has been the emergence of new organizations in this area. Whether it's the Fridays for Future, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, but also whether it's We Mean Business and organizations like that on the business side. It's just been. We need a breadth of organizations thinking about the future and experimenting about the future. So the last thing I would want is, WWF being the only ones or the dominant ones or something like that. It's really about very broad coalitions of very different actors coming together with a common set of objectives, such as making the Paris Climate Accord happen, but then with very different approaches for how we make that happen. And I think that's the really exciting moment we're in. There is a lot of experimenting happening, and there's a lot we can learn from each other. And also for an organization like ours, which is about 60 years old, I am humbled by some of the amazing work being done by movements which were not around 3 years ago. There's so much we can learn from each other. Thank you.
I think those are very wonderful closing remarks, if I allow. yeah, we do only have 1 minute left. So if there's anything that you left unsaid, which I don't hope, Thomas, then feel free to say that now. But it was wonderful listening to you so far.
No, I wouldn't dare to after going over time so much beforehand. But just thanks for the engagement and for the questions. There's been a very thoughtful set of questions I got, and it's just good to see people thinking about this, because I think reflecting on the crisis and reflecting on the opportunities together is really the first essential step. And to do that beyond the crystal balls and beyond the cheap propaganda that is happening, and really deeply thinking about what can we make happen here together. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. That's very beautifully put. So all that's left to do is really to thank you deeply for this wonderful presentation. Very inspiring, very engaging, and also full of facts, which is really important. So thanks to you. Also thanks to the in between 85 people who tuned in from all over the globe. It's wonderful to see you here, and we're very glad that you are enjoying this session, and also others. With regards to other sessions, the next one is coming up live with Impact Hub on May 28th. Thank you, Thomas, for putting up the slide. It's again 5 p.m. Central European summertime, and it's about navigating resilient enterprises with experts from EY Ripples, Ernst & Young Ripples. And regarding this live, we will, I've received a couple of questions, so you guys will definitely receive the recording of this call. So in there, you will then, of course, as the screen share was on, have the presentation in there as well. And we will also send around a satisfaction survey, because we would love to improve our offering to whatever brings most value to you, because that's what counts at the end of the day. If you want to connect with us, use the email address connect@impacthub.net for any kind of questions or any kind of engagement. And with that, thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of the day, full day. Good night, good morning, good afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.